The pad crawler is a largemouth bass fly designed specifically for heavy cover. I started working on the pattern about a decade ago after getting frustrated with having to choose between bypassing productive water or continually retrieving snagged flies. The folded foam head causes the fly to dive when stripped and, more importantly, acts as a weed guard. It can be thrown into the middle of lily pads and, if stripped steadily, usually comes through without getting snagged. If you're interested in tying this fly, a materials list is in the description, along with a link to our website where you can buy all the materials. Slide a bead onto the hook. Then put the hook in your vise. With the bead at the back of the hook, start the thread on the straight portion of the hook shank just behind the front bend. Trim the thread and lay down a thread layer about as long as the width of the bead, finishing with the thread just behind the bend. Slide the bead up, positioning it just behind the jig bend. Lash it down to the hook, with crisscrossing wraps going over the bead on the point side of the hook. The effect will be to push the bead down away from the hook point towards what will be the bottom of the fly. Tie a whip finish right behind the bead. Then move the thread in front of the bead and secure it with a half hitch. If you want to increase the durability of the fly, add some head cement or UV resin on the whip finish behind the bead. The first part of the wing is made with olive supreme hair. I use a bundle that is slightly thicker than a No. 2 pencil lead when compressed. To keep from making a mess, I gather the materials together, tie an overhand knot in the end closest to the connection point, and cut the bundle away from the rest of the material. Then I'll tie a knot at the other end and cut the bundle in half. Measure the supreme hair against the hook. You should have a length of about 2.5 times the hook length, extending past the tie-in point. Tie it in on the point side of the hook, the top of the fly, just in front of the bead, wrapping it back against the bead so it sticks up over the hook point. Trim off the excess material, and bind the butt ends down securely, finishing with the thread just in front of the bead. The top of the wing is made of Arctic goat hair. Cut off an amount that looks about as thick as a supreme hair. Clean it up by removing the loose underfur. I'm going to add in another bunch of already cleaned material since I don't have quite enough. Measure the Arctic goat against the supreme hair so the tips extend to the same place. Tie in the Arctic goat, making sure the material stays in a tight clump on top of the supreme hair. Trim the butt ends to a taper and bind them down, finishing with the thread right in front of the wing. Gather the supreme hair and goat hair together, making sure they are arranged like you want. With a short length of thread between the hook and the bobbin, carefully bring the thread around under the hook and wrap directly behind the wing, dropping the bobbin on the far side. Bring the thread around in front of the wing, over the top of the hook shank, back behind, then drop it over again, finishing a complete wrap around the base of the wing. Posting the wing like this will help keep the materials together and will force the wing to stick up away from the hook shank. Do this 4 or 5 times, then finish with locking wraps directly in front. Next, tie a Grizzly Marabou feather on top of the hook, which will be the bottom of the fly. A hook shank length works well. As you tie the feather in, work to distribute it evenly around the bead. Trim the butt end off and bind it down. Finish with your thread right up against the front of the marabou. The thread should be around 1/3 of the way up the flat part of the shank between the bead and the hook eye, with plenty of room still in front. Now it's time for the most important part of the fly. Cut a strip of 2 mm sheet foam about 3/8 of an inch wide. A straight edge and a sharp knife makes it easy to cut clean, even strips. Use your scissors to cut a V into one end of the strip. This V will wrap around the wing and help keep it in place. Lay the foam onto the top of the fly with the V extending a little way back over the wing. Place a couple of loose wraps over the foam, then hold it in place as you tighten the wraps. Continue wrapping, using enough tension to flare the foam and bind it down securely, but not so much that you cut it. Pull the foam back and place some locking wraps directly in front. Next, fold the foam back on itself towards the front. Make sure that even when pulled tight, the foam doesn't quite reach the hook point. The foam doesn't need to be very close to the hook point to be an effective weed guard. When you're happy with the length, wrap over the foam to lock it in place. Bring the thread in front of the foam and add a few wraps. Then, while holding the foam back and out of the way, whip finish just behind the hook eye. I like to use 2 4 or 5 turn whip finishes. Trim your thread, then trim the excess foam extending over the hook eye. I start by cutting back from each side to form a V. Then I'll trim any remaining pieces that stick out. Check the fly to make sure it is straight and make any necessary adjustments. The final step is to head cement the wraps. I like to use UV resin in place of standard head cement since it makes the exposed thread wraps more durable. When fishing heavy cover, try to keep your line straight from the rod tip to the fly. Strip steadily and be ready to set the hook hard when a fish eats.
It's a big fish.
You may miss a few more hits than you would without the Weedguard, but since this fly will go where few others can, these are bites you probably wouldn't have gotten with a more standard fly. I use a factory tapered leader so there are no knots to catch on vegetation, and go with at least a 16-pound tippet so I can pull fish out of cover. I tie this fly in several variations, but this is my favorite and the primary variation I've been using for the past several years. Though the fly is made for cover, it works surprisingly well on shorelines and even in open water. A solid strip will pull the fly below the surface, and a pause will let it rise again. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more like it, please subscribe.